In all seriousness, I know this is going to sound like a joke. It's not. If I could invite Peter Muserlian to come up again. We're just going to do this every hour or so, just to give Peter a little bit of exercise and come up here. No, in all seriousness, we goofed up a little bit earlier because we were a little bit of miscommunication. But we have something we'd like to present to Peter as a token of thanks for his great contributions to this conference and putting together the video that showed last night. And on behalf of the organizers of this conference, including the Armenian Genocide Museum and Institute in Yerevan, represented by Haig, we'd like to present Peter with the Clara Barton Humanitarian Award. Wow. Gold medal. So, Haig, please. We have it this time, Peter.
Oh my God.
It's real.
I didn't know this was going to happen.
Don't trip.
Who's going to shoot this for me?
Oh, who's going to shoot this? I don't know.
Yeah. Who wants to hold my phone?
Are you Skyping your family? Okay. Oh, yes, absolutely.
That was nice. That was great. Thank you.
We'll be seeing you again later.
Yeah, they're going to show it in an hour or
So
so.
on to the afternoon session on Armenian-American art, film, and literature, and I'd like to invite our moderator to come up, Doris Melkonian. Doris is a doctoral candidate at UCLA and a graduate student at Fullerton Theological Seminary, and we are very happy to have her here as our moderator for this next session with the panelists. So, take your places. It's all yours.
Thank you, Mark. It is indeed my pleasure to moderate this next session on Armenian-American art, film, and literature. Our first speaker is Professor Hernard Zeiten Wattenbaugh, and she is a professor of art history at the University of California in Davis. She specializes in the visual cultures of the Middle East, including architectural preservation, museums, and cultural heritage. Hernard is a recipient of many awards for her publications. She is an active member of MESA, and she's a very good friend. I'd like to invite her to the podium now.
Okay, it works. Can you all hear me? Great. I will turn, you can't see me. Okay. Is that slightly better? I can't get taller, I don't think. All right, my timer is on. Okay. Thank you so much for inviting me to this wonderful conference. It's a great honor for me to be here amongst so many friends, old friends and new friends. People I admire, people whose work has been such a source of inspiration for me. So, oh, yeah, we can do that. That's great. Is that better? Okay, thank you. All right. So we have heard so many interesting papers about the achievements of Armenians in the United States, about the challenges they have faced, about their achievements. Today I want to talk about objects of Armenian heritage. and how appropriate it is that we're here near the Ararat Eskijian Museum, and the exhibition that is in the hallway next door is full of wonderful remnants of the material heritage of Armenians in the United States. So I want to focus on the works of Armenian art in particular that have ended up at some of the most important museums in the United States. And to reflect on the fact that Armenian art is also part of the American experience in Armenian and American culture, especially medieval Armenian art. In particular, I want to focus on an artist, a medieval artist who has been called the greatest Armenian painter of the Middle Ages, Toros Roslin. He is the only visual artist represented on the facade of the Madenataran, a facade which features statues from great men, they're all men, who are the makers of the Armenian nation. And Toros Roslin is the only artist represented in this pantheon of makers of the Armenian nation. And there he is, a 1969 statue of Toros Roslin. What do we know about Toros Roslin? Until about a century ago, he was completely unknown. The first scholarly article about Toros Roslin was published in 1910, where a scholarly archbishop, Dermovsesian, introduced to his readers an unknown painter, Toros Roslin, that he had discovered in the library of the Armenian Patriarchate in Jerusalem, and he introduced his readers to the wonderful artistry of this unknown painter. A century later, Toros Roslin is one of the best known names in Armenian art history, and his name and his memory are part of our everyday experience of Armenian culture. He is known, Toros Roslin is known through 7 works that have survived, 7 complete manuscripts that have been signed by him. And the very first work that we know of him, dated 1256, is the Zeiten Gospels. The Zeiten Gospels exist today in 2 parts. Most of the manuscript is at the Madenataran in Yerevan, and 8 pages, 8 beautifully illuminated pages out of this manuscript are at the Getty Museum just down the street here in Los Angeles. I will be talking a little bit more about this particular manuscript. Another one of those 7 signed works by Roslin, some would say his most beautiful work, is the Sivas Gospels, today known as the Toros Roslin Gospels, that are in the collection of the Walters Museum in Baltimore. And there is yet another, actually I know why I need this up here, because I need to see what is. So, sorry. So in addition to the 7 manuscripts attributed to Roslin, of which 2 are in the United States, there's a number of manuscripts that are almost certainly by him. We don't have his signature remaining, but judging from stylistic elements, they are almost certainly by him. And of this group of manuscripts attributed to Toros Roslin, one of them, probably dated around 1268, is also in the United States at the Freer Gallery of Art in Washington, D.C. Now I want to reflect a little bit on what were the circumstances that brought these masterpieces of Armenian art in the United States. What was the experience of these works of art immigrating into the United States? What was the relationship of these works of art to the individuals that brought them here? And what do these works of art mean to us today, both as Americans and as Armenians? So I'm going to take the example of the Zeiten Gospels, this first signed work by Toros Roslin. And what you're seeing on the screen is the work, the Zeiten Gospels on display at the Madenataran today. And this is its cover. So the bulk of the manuscript is in the Madinataran, but 8 pages out of it are in the Getty Museum. They were incorporated into the collection of the Getty in 1994. The 8 pages that are at the Getty are Canon Tables. So we have 8 pages grouped in 4 pairs. So this is the first pair, the second pair, the third pair, and the fourth pair. So each pair, Roslin imagines them as facing pages, and they have similarities and very subtle differences, and they are meant to be seen together. Canon Tables, or Khoranner in Armenian, were a feature of medieval Bibles, Gospels rather, and they are essentially a particular kind of index tables that shows where the same event occurred in one or more of the 4 Gospels. So for medieval Christianity, the Canon Tables were theologically very important because they showed the convergences of the story of Christ between the four Gospels, and they also, through the design of the Canon Tables, had implications. They reflected certain theological points rendered in a visual idiom and reinforced the connections between the Old Testament and the New Testament. The idea in Christianity that important events, important beliefs in Christianity were already foreshadowed in the Old Testament or Hebrew Bible. Oftentimes in medieval Gospels, the Canon Tables were the most densely illustrated elements, more than figural paintings, more than, say, images of the Annunciation or the Nativity or other important elements of the life of Christ that we often find illustrated in Gospel books. In general, in medieval Gospels, and especially in the medieval Armenian tradition, the Canon Tables were a particular focus of artistic expression. And of course, the Canon Tables that are at the Getty today are a particularly, I think, wonderful example of Canon Tables. These 4 pages were meant to be grouped together originally as is seen, so in this diagram, so that the facing pages, the right pairs would be facing each other. But of course, once each of these bifolia, so the large piece of parchment that was supposed to have more than 1 page, once they are detached, removed from the book, and once they are put on display, what you see is that what is on the larger piece of parchment are not the pages that were meant to be facing each other, but 2 mismatched pairs. They are still beautiful. They are still amazing works of art that you can see on display at the Getty. They do come on, they rotate them on display because they are very sensitive to light. But what you are seeing when you visit them in Los Angeles is not what Toros Roslin intended you to see. It is what you're seeing because the manuscript has been, because these pages have been detached from the manuscript. Also, when you look at the pages on display, you will notice something that you don't readily see in a photographic reproduction, and that is a horizontal crease that goes, very subtle horizontal crease that goes in the middle of the bifolium, in the middle of these 2 pages. And that probably took place when the person that removed these 8 pages from the Zeiten Gospels probably folded them and put them away and took them. And so the crease in the bifolia that we see today is one of the physical features that remain on the artwork that remind us of the life experience of the artwork, of the experiences that it has gone through. And of course, the history of the 4 pages being detached from the manuscript took place during and right after the Armenian genocide. So let me briefly walk you through the 7 centuries of the existence of this manuscript in 15 minutes or less. The manuscript was created in Hromgla, the castle of Hromgla on the westernmost bend of the Euphrates, militarily, strategically important castle, but also religiously important during the kingdom, the Cilician kingdom of Armenia, because that was where the Catholicos of Cilicia had his seat. And this is what Hromgla, medieval Hromgla, looks like today. It's called Rumkale, it's near Urfa. And it looks today like an island, but that was not its medieval appearance. It is surrounded by water today because of a series of dams created in the 2000s have changed the landscape of this area. While Hromgla in the later Middle Ages was, of course, no longer a center of the Armenian Church, the Catholicos had moved his seat to Sis centuries before. But until the eve of the genocide, Rumkale or Hromgla was a center for pilgrimage for Armenians. And it continues to have several buildings that are very interesting architecturally, and no excavation has taken place here, but there are probably a lot of very interesting things buried on these mounds. I want to show you this remnants. It is part of a tower that was probably incorporated into either a church or another important building. It is made with very carefully crafted stone, and it features these two khachkars that are embedded in the facade of the building. And these khachkars this is the way they appear today. You can still see the remnants of Armenian letters, the abbreviation for Jesus Christos, partially scraped out. And you see the remnants of an Armenian cross that has also been scraped out. When the mutilation of Hromgla took place is not clear, but there is some indication that it took place in the 19th century, at some unknown point in the 19th century. The Zeiten Gospels was written in copied and illuminated in 1256. And 1256 is a very important year in the history of the Cilician kingdom, because that is the year where the King Hetum had gone to Karakorum, the seat of the great Khan, the great Mongol Khan, and had negotiated with him and had concluded a treaty of friendship between the Armenians and the Mongols, which was to be such an important turning point in Armenian history. What I'm showing you on the screen is a coin minted at Sis in 1241, so just before Hetum's great trip. And it is a bilingual coin. On one side, we have an image of Hetum and his name, of course. And on the other side, we have an inscription by the Seljuk Sultan Khosrow II. The coin was minted at Sis, and it shows the very interesting relationship between the Seljuk Sultan and the Armenian king at the time. They were ostensibly friends, they were also enemies, they were also competitors, they were also competing to be vassals, one of the other. So this coin reflects that very tense relationship. The Zeiten Gospels was created in this critical year of 1256. At some unknown point in time, but probably before the 17th century, the gospel moved to Zeitun, and that's why it is known as the Zeiten Gospels. And I don't think I need to introduce this audience to the importance of the city of Zeitun and its image and what it represents for Armenians. In this image, the lower image where you see this fantastic citadel of Zeitun and a building that is jutting out of this rocky outcrop, that is where the Church of the Holy Mother of God was once located, and that is where we are told the manuscript was kept in a special special iron box. In 1915, when the Zaitunsis were removed from their mountain stronghold, the family most closely associated with the Zeiten Gospels were allowed to spend some time in Mirage. They took the Gospels with them. So in Mirage, I'm going to scroll forward here. And in Mirage, the family came into contact with this individual, Dr. Hagopian the Rug Maker, who is both a prominent surgeon of Mirage, who practiced in the German hospital, but he was also an amateur historian, and he has compiled this beautiful map of Mirage, which he drew from memory in exile in Aleppo. So in Mirage, the manuscript changed hands. Dr. Der Hazarian kept the manuscript safe during the years of the genocide. He was exempted from deportation because he was a military surgeon. But of course, in 1922, we have the Battle of Mirage, and this is a photograph taken by Stanley Kerr, the American Near East relief worker who was stationed at Mirage, showing the beginnings of the burning of Mirage when Kemalist Turkish forces and the local Armenians and the occupying French force were engaged in a very complex battle. Here, the manuscript came into contact with another Marashti family, the Atamian family. This is a photograph of the family taken around 1912. And the little boy closest to me on the screen is Hagop Atamian. In 1915, Hagop Atamian, in 1920 rather, Battle of Mirage, Hagop Atamian was about 13 years old. The manuscript came to be in their possession, and Hagop tells us in his own testimony several decades later that he was the one who removed several pages from this manuscript and kept it with him because he feared that if the manuscript was lost, they couldn't take it with them, that there would be no memory left of the Armenians of Mirage, so he wished to keep that with him. And this is where the history of the manuscript intersects with the history of Armenian-Americans. By 1923, the Atamian family immigrated to the United States. This is their Ellis Island ship manifest. They were admitted into the United States. And a few years later, they had established themselves in Watertown. And this is a family photo from about 1923. So they have now become Americans. Hagop continued to keep the manuscript, and it passed, after his death, it passed to other members of the family. And in 1994, it was purchased by the Getty. So one more intersection of the manuscript with the history of Armenian culture in America is that it so happened that the manuscript intersected with two of the most important scholars of Armenian art history. One, Archbishop, then Archbishop, later Catholicos Karekin Hovsepian, who was at the time Archbishop of New York. He had been sent by the Catholicos of Echmiadzin to try to heal the rift in the Armenian church in the United States that we heard about earlier. He was unsuccessful in that effort, but he did see the 8 pages. They were shown to him, and he incorporated them in a study that he wrote about Toros Roslin that was published in New York. Another great scholar of Armenian art, here seen as a student in Paris, Sirarpi Dernersessian, who was a professor of art history at Harvard and later at Dumbarton Oaks, was able to study the mother manuscript in Istanbul, but she never saw the fragment, the 8 pages. So it's very fortuitous that this manuscript has intersected with 2 of the most important scholars of Armenian art history. But one of them saw one part of the manuscript and the other one saw the fragment. And it was only in 1994 that the fragment was identified as being part of the manuscript. And one last episode in the life of this manuscript is that after it was purchased by the Getty in 1994, between 2010 and 2015, it was the subject of a very prominent, highly publicized lawsuit between the Western Prelacy of the Armenian Church and the Getty Museum. The prelacy argued that the manuscript pages had been stolen and therefore had to be returned to the church. And after 5 years of litigation, the parties settled, and this is from the reception that marked the agreement between the two parties. So in yet another way, this manuscript intersected with the life of Armenian culture in the United States by being the subject of the first and so far only restitution court case involving Armenian cultural heritage. Thank you.
Thank you, Hernad, for this illuminating presentation on Toros Roslin's manuscripts. Our next speaker is a film scholar, Mr. Zare Arev Shatian, who is a graduate from the California State University of Northridge. He has many films and projects to his credit, and they're listed in our program. But I just wanted to mention that he teaches film at Los Angeles Mission College, the New York Film Academy, the Los Angeles Academy of Figurative Arts, and at UCLA. He is currently working on his first film project, and it's a comprehensive biography of the director, Rupen Mamoulian. So please, let's give him a warm welcome. He will be talking about Armenian-Americans in the film industry.
Walkthrough, greetings. Last night, Dr. Papazian proposed a very interesting and complicated question asking who is an Armenian? Not having the intention of taking this down to a level of a joke, but I automatically thought of comedian James Foxworthy, who had this routine of, you're a redneck if you, Years ago, Vahe Berberian did the same thing, that you're an Armenian if you do these certain kind of things. And one of these things was that if you are in a movie theater, and at the very end you sit for the credits and looking for the IANs at the very end. At the time, I took issues with that because I'm one of those guys. I knew it was going to come in handy one day, and here it is. Anyway, before I start, I would like to thank the organizers, Maggie especially, who invited me sight unseen, even though I'm usually known for my unorthodox presentations. But more than that, I would like to extend my thanks to Harut Arakelian. I don't know if he's here, but if you are not and you are watching us, thank you very much. And costume designer extraordinaire Deborah Landis, who was a tremendous help in helping me to come up with some of these, characters and personnel that I'm going to present. The other thing is that please be advised that I only have a limited amount of time, and I cannot cover everybody. So there'll be omissions, but they're not personal. They're just, I have to skip over them, and I'll see what I can do before I'm kicked out of here forever for going over. Okay. So I would like to begin with a very short clip. If this thing works. Arthur, this seems to be stuck.
Hey,
Okay.
Lois, I spent the afternoon making a list of famous Armenians. Eric Bogosian, Andre Agassi, Jerry the Shark Tarkanian. That is all.
Okay, well, hopefully by the end of today, you'll be able to name more than 3 Armenians. Okay, the cinema was obviously, as many people might know, was invented in France through the brothers Louis and Auguste Lumière. And I think it's only appropriate that to make a note that cinema is an art form that requires light, it uses light, and it produces light. And it was invented by brothers who were named Light in French. In the early days, there were no directors. There were simply cameramen. People who had cameras were in charge of the show. And they would just bring people in front of the camera, ask them to do things, and they would film them. Many of these films were very short, 7 to 10 minutes, 1 reels, basically. And not many people, if at all, got credit. So nobody knew who was in them. Not even the name of the director was known. People had nicknames for the actors, like the woman with the curly hair or the guy with the gap tooth or whatever. They didn't know who they were. But the screen credits did not really become part of the movies until 1915, when the movies really started to really get to be much more advanced compared to the early stuff. As far as numbers, I don't have to mention that number-wise, Armenians are a minority, and it will be impossible to even fathom back in those days that there would be Armenians in the film industry. Very few, not many. The case was not so in Europe, though. I mean, they were a lot more active in Europe than they were here in America for various reasons. The first and foremost indirect influence of Armenians on American cinema comes in the form of an actor. Mukesh Balian was born in Erzurum. He went to the Moscow Art Theater in 1906, and he studied under the master Konstantin Stanislavski. In 1908, with a very good friend of his, who happened to be a millionaire, Nikolai Tarasov, Torosian, they formed a show called The Bat, Churchik, which was basically a collection of different sketches, and Balian was the MC. He was the character who would introduce the sketches, but he would do it in a very unusual way in a cabaret format. That show proved to be extremely popular, but when Lenin took over, Balian left the country. He went to France, and then eventually on a tour, he came to New York. In France, he did the same thing. He recreated the bat as part of his repertoire, and he mostly translated everything that he had done in Russian with this ensemble into French. Then, when they toured the U.S. in 1922, when they came to New York, they did exactly the same thing. Now, you might ask, what does this have to do with cinema? Well, nothing directly, but here's the important thing. He is assumed to be one of the very first people who introduced the method acting to America, especially to theater. Not as much to movies, but very much influential in the field of theater. And of course, when we get later on, if you are familiar with the American film history, later in the 40s and the 50s, especially in the 50s, you had all these method actors who were coming out of the Actors Studio in New York. They were all directly influenced by these various Russian acting instructors. And Balayev, or Balian, was one of them. This is a poster for one of the shows that they had done in New York. And there is Balian with Charlie Chaplin, even. The extent of acting personnel in the film industry, as I said, was very limited. And usually what would happen is that if you were successful on Broadway or you had a good show somewhere, they would invite you to be in the movies just for the novelty of it, not because you had talent of acting or anything. Not even if you look good. That was not an issue in the beginning. Later it did become an issue, of course. But one of the early actresses that appeared in the movies was Flora Zabel Mangasarian. She was a very well-known and well-established Broadway singer, and because of her popularity, she was invited to be in some movies. In the teens, from 1914 to about 18, she did about 6 or 7 films. She did not do any major roles, but her, her face was very familiar to a point where even in advertisements, her likeness was used to sell the Fatima cigarettes back in those days. And right next to it is one ad from one of her movies, The Red Widow, and she's right there. And that you can see is John Barrymore is the star, who is Drew Barrymore's great-grandfather. The Barrymores were a very big acting family back in those days. Now, there were a few films that included Armenian subjects. Now, no Armenians were in these movies, but somehow Hollywood found the subject of, depicting the East as this exotic Oriental place that people had never been to. And especially, after World War I and during World War I, they thought it was a good topic to show it in movies. So there were a few films that were produced in Hollywood in the early days that do have some sort of a background, whether in the setting or the characters, even though, again, none of them are Armenians. The first one was called The Spoiler in 1915, which is basically about a German colonel who gets involved, with the Kurds, and by virtue of some dealings here and there, he allows the Kurds to attack an abbey where Armenian women are taking refuge, and they get raped, basically. It is typical Hollywood stuff back in those days. Unbeknownst to the colonel, his daughter is among them. So that is that's the suspense element of the film. This film was recently restored by Cinémathèque Française, like 3 years ago, and it's about 20-25 minutes long. Again, no Armenians are in this movie, but it has the characters of Armenian women in the Abbey. Then there is also a film called Aladdin from Broadway in 1917, which deals with an Englishman who has to leave his wife and daughter, who are Armenian, and go on a trip. And when he comes back, they are, of course, being kidnapped by the Turks. And then he's on a search to go and find them, but by the time he gets to locate them, it's too late. They've been converted to Muslims, and then there's, of course, the conflict begins there. What's going to happen at the end? And of course, everybody pretty much knows about Auction of Souls, and probably don't have to spend too much time on this movie. But you can see a typical ad that says $10 per seat. Most of these screenings were used as fundraising for the Near Eastern relief and the victims of the genocide. Aurora Mardiganian's account was very cogently put together by film scholar Anthony Slide in his book Ravished Armenia, which basically recreates the sequences of the film, which no longer exist in its entirety, and includes an interview with Aurora Mardiganian, Arsha Luis Mardiganian, a few years before she passed away. Now, there were also some documentaries. Again, the fact of the East, the exotism of the East was very captivating. So this is an ad for a film called Not Guilty. It has nothing to do with the Armenians, but if you pay attention below it, in that box, which I've enlarged and put it next to it, there is a documentary called Hagopian the Rug Maker. And this was one of the earliest examples of color film, which was done in Prismacolor. It's an additive process where you add two colors to create a third color. It was in its infancy, in this time. And it's basically a documentary, it's an educational documentary that shows you how rugs are made. The film is about 30 minutes, and it does spend time to tell you, it shows you how they, have sheep and how they deal with the sheep and the wool and all that stuff. You see the process of making the knots and everything dyeing, the vegetable dyes and all that stuff is all explained in this little documentary. Then there were a series of comedy films which starred Alberta Vaughn as Maisie, and Adventures of Maisie was a compilation of about 13 smaller chapters. Each one had a different story, but one of these chapters is called The Vanishing Armenian. And unfortunately, there are no descriptions of what this movie is about. But that's all I've been able to find in newspapers and advertisings, unless they actually locate the print, we would not know. Since we're in the silent era, of course, the Keystone Cops were very popular, slapstick comedy. This is the very physical comedy where people run at a very high speed in the walls and bounce back and nothing happens. The violence is very cartoonish and things like that. But one person who was actually a beginner in his career, which turned out to be not a movie career, was Hal Kesheshian Priest. And he is the third from left. He's there. He appeared in about 25 films by Mack Sennett, who was in charge of these Keystone Cops. More than that, though, he is known in a different way because he was actually a bronze medal winner in 1920s Antwerp Olympics in diving. And he was also the oldest Olympian who was still alive. He died when he was 104 years old. But this guy, was not a kind of person who would stand still. He actually stole the 1920 Olympic flag off of the pole after the closing ceremonies. He was dared by a friend, and he got it up on the pole, and he stole it, and he kept it until the 2000 Summer Olympics in Sydney. That's when he returned it, because people were still looking for this. And the value of this was that this was the first time that you have a flag with, 5 interconnecting, links, the rings together. The next person would be Arthur Edmund Cariou, Josep Josepian, and he was born in Trabzon. He was usually cast as a villain in horror movies, especially silent horror movies. He actually appeared with Lon Chaney in the 1920s version of Phantom of the Opera, the silent version of Phantom of the Opera. Dr. X, A Mystery of the Wax Museum, the original, and many, many others. He was known for his eyes because he had this really dark and deep eyes, and the look that he would cast would really scare everybody off. So he was always typecasted as this villain. One of the interesting things is that, unfortunately, had he accepted an offer, things would have been different. But he was the first one who was offered to play the role of Dracula. But he declined, and the role went to, of course, Bela Lugosi, and then that he became the face that we associate with Bela Lugosi. One last thing before I finish, I just wanted to let you know that because movies are comprised of so many different fields, there is almost impossible for me to come up with a cohesive narrative to tie everything together, because one thing happens here, the other things happens over there. But I was also going to cover some of the musicians, but there aren't that many musicians. Again, going back to the idea of, skip that. Going to the exotic and the Orient, every time there was a film that had a scene set in the Middle East or somewhere, that required an oud player or a tar player or somebody, it would be always Armenian musicians who would be hired to do this. And you had people like George Shap Armenian and many others, even though they never got credit, but they are part of these movies. The first Armenian language film in America was done by Setrak Vartian, and that was Arshin Malalan in 1937. I have a very short clip I would like to play. This clip does not have a subtitle, but when the film was released, it did have subtitles. So here we go. Okay, so that's an example of that. As you can see, it's very theatrical. The camera does not move. It's very simply staged, and it's just basically a performance. All the songs were translated, of course, from Azeri to Armenian, because it's a very popular operetta. Now, this was not a Hollywood movie. This was done independently at the time in the 30s, when there were other ethnic groups like Ukrainians and the Jews were doing their own ethnic cinema, especially during the revival of what is known as the Yiddish cinema, where the Jews were making movies for their own communities. And this was one of the one-offs at the time. The first Hollywood movie, and this is I'm going to end with this the first Hollywood movie ever to include an Armenian dialogue is in this film right here.
Here it is. This is it. The place I was telling you about. The Armenian Social Center, rest haven for soldiers, sailors. This is it.
Are you sure they got female dames in here?
Oh, lift your antenna. Tune it in. Don't you get the vibrations?
Sailors. That's disgraceful. Tell me, how's the food in there?
Armenian. Shish kebab.
Shish kebab, pilaf. Now he's talking. What are you waiting for? Open the door.
Let's go.
Jackpot! At ease, folks.
Sirele Harenagisner, as Anushtakner, Kugan destroyer and USS Poe.
USS Poe, one of the finest ships in the Navy, 35 knots.
Wait a minute, Ski, wait a minute. Yep, Gidekinchen, Asong says he Hamarka Karabin, Yep, Gidekinchen says he Amen make had cousins.
Tell them how we captured Flatbush. Tell them how we sneaked in and captured Flatbush.
Flatbush got in Japan and Kainu So, cousins, let's show our sailor cousins what Armenian hospitality really is. Hit it now. Hi there, Captain!
How we get the food?
What do you think, Chief? My name's Sarma, Kufta, Dolma, Yep Pilaf, 2 Scotch and waters.
Double. Hurry up.
How do you like the place?
Nice.
Hey, girls, don't fight. I've got 2 days.
Are you Armenian?
Sure, honorary.
Let's go.
Okay, that of course, the guy who spoke Armenian was Ras Bagdasaryan, who was the creator of the Chipmunks and first cousin of William Saroyan. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Zade, for this very interesting presentation and for introducing us to these rare films. Our next presenter is an author. I'd like to introduce Mark Audax, who has authored many books. Among them is In My Father's Name and The King of California. Mark's best-selling books are compared to William Saroyan's, and he's been noted as, well, his books have been compared to the great social portraits of William Saroyan. Now, Mark has just completed his last book. His newest book is The Dreamt Land, and it will be published next spring. So we look forward to that publication. So I would like to invite Mark to the podium to hear his presentation on Old Land, New Land, Armenian-American writers, and the literary journey out of genocide. Mark, please.
Good afternoon. Maggie, thanks for having me here. I drove up from Fresno just a few hours ago. I was going to come in last night, but it was a good storm. We needed it. I don't have any audio visuals, so I'm going to have to resort to some tricks to keep you guys interested here. So about 4 years ago, I was in the middle of a novel about a character named Nish Hosepian, who happened to work for a big city newspaper and then wrote a piece about the Armenian genocide, and the piece got killed by his editor. And it sets off all these interesting things that happen. And then I got a call from my agent in New York. She said, there's a drought in California. I said, yes, there is. She said, would you like to do a book about the drought? I have some interest by Knopf, which is a publisher I've never worked for before. I said, sure. So wrote a proposal, sold the idea. Drought went from 1 year to second year to the third year to the fourth year. And then I got a call from the editor, Knopf. He said, how's it going? I said, it's all right, but I'm a little sidetracked. He said, why? I said, well, I'm telling the story of California, okay, how we've bent water and conjured dust to create this place. And I'm also weaving in my family story. He got a little nervous at that. And so, fifth year drought came, then a flood came, then the mudslides and the wildfires, and he called again. He said, where's the manuscript? I said, well, it's about 500 pages. So I knew that the family section was ripe for editing. I sent it to him, and I got a call back a couple weeks ago, and he said, we're going to take all 500 pages. So the story of the family, I just could not tell the story of California without telling the story of the journey out of genocide to Fresno, the story of the land. You know, we have oud players who are growing raisins. And Richard Hagopian is in this book. What a wonderful storyteller he is. And then I've got my grandfather coming over in 1920, which is a pivotal year because it's the year they discover this turbine pump that allows these farmers not just to take the river's waters, but then to go into the earth 2,000 feet and draw out water. So in every which way, I involve the family. So that playing out on the land and the family story is something at the heart of the Armenian-American writing experience. And in 2007, I got a call from David Kerdyan. My cousin Aris Janigian and I knew David, and he said, listen, I have an idea for a book. It's called Forgotten Bread, and it is the story of Armenian-American literature coming out of the genocide to here. And he asked me to write about Saroyan and A.I. Bezerdes. Saroyan I knew, Bezerdes I really didn't. And so as I got this assignment and kind of started playing with it, I thought there was something interesting about my grandfather, who was a poet who came out of the genocide, was born in 1900, left in 1920, Bursa, came here, And then Zorabian, who was just 8 years younger, but born in the United States, and how their writing was so much different. Okay? One was writing in Armenian, one was writing in English, and that was something that was a profound kind of difference between them. And the same with Bezertes. Bezertes grew up in Fresno. He came at 1, and he was born a year after, or the same year as Zorabian. And so I began to kind of formulate a premise about these writers. And this book, Forgotten Bread, it's a lovely book if you haven't purchased it. And it's second-generation Armenian-American writers writing bios on the first-generation Armenian-American writers. And these are the writers that we focused on. Leon Zorabian Harold, Emmanuel Varanian, Leon Sermelian, Soroyan, A.I. Bezertes, Richard Hagopian, Chachig Manassian, Archie, who was William's cousin, Marjorie Hosepian, Peter Surian, Harry Barba, Diana Derhovanessian, Michael J. Arlen, David Kerdian, Harold Bond, Helen Pilibosian, Peter Najarian, and then Arlene Avakian. What you see is the writers who were born in Armenia, who came out of the genocide, are not freed of the village. In fact, much of their writing is trying to reconcile that past. And it's almost, they have to almost write about it, that memory, and it's only then that they're freed up to deal with the place that they've come to. And so there's this split in their writing. Zorabian, Varanian, Sermelian really show this. The ones that are born in the United States, then they're not free of the past at all, but they're free of that village. And then we go on and they start telling the story of assimilation. Hagopian is born in Worcester, Massachusetts, Surian in Boston, Harry Barba, Bristol, Connecticut. Then we have Michael Arlen, Passage to Arat, that journey back. You know, he was not told the story. His father had hid it from him. So that journey back to Armenia becomes a discovery of that secret. So I can't do them all, and we have a pretty good familiarity to Soroyan, but I want to introduce you to a couple of these writers and some of their works, and then maybe you can at some point go and buy this book and really spend some time with it. So let's start with Leon Zorabian Harold. I don't know how that last name Harold came in, but it's almost, you know, newspapers were called Harold. You're heralding something. And he was, he did his schooling in Erzurum. He left Erzurum at the age of 17 in 1912 and landed in Detroit. And this is one of the things he writes. He goes to work for the Ford Motor Company. What a morning. The living monsters curling their arms. This is the factory. Waving them in sleeves, beckoning me. Their roaring and clanging is audible. They are calling for fresh, wild blood. I am guided in a fantastic land where youthful people are sacrificed to fiery gods. So I bowed to the raging, fuming, fire-spitting faces of gods in their temple of the foundry, gods more awesome than those in books. Leon Zorabian Harold. He is obviously haunted by the past. He's not free of it, and much of his poetry is trying to figure that past out. Here is a poem that he writes to his sister who died back there. Her name was Helena. Helena, before our village goes to heaven to become a luminous city, as lovely small things grow large in heaven, as unhappy little children rest in Jesus' arm in heaven, you have come to see me at the meeting place of dream hour. Helena, call your followers and let us rest in this grove of stars before I arrive at earth again and you in heaven. It is good that there is a heaven to be reciprocated with, where you can go tell God why you had to leave. Our village, all together. Helena, you will be the spokesman of our village. Helena, for your sake, I will transplant our Armenian mountains in America. In the state of Wisconsin now, in which to hear the echoes of your girlish voice, you seated in our valleys, for your sake, I will pack our fields and everything they hold, crops and animals, on the back of my imagination. My imagination, a fire-shod steed, will become a pack animal. For your sake, for your sake. So, this is someone obviously caught between two lands. And his writing is also caught between those two lands. And you can see almost this split, whereas he's dealing and has dealt with the past, he is then free to then deal with the United States. Leon Sermelian, same thing. Was born in Armenia in 1907, lands in Kansas 10 years later. One of his first things to do is to write about the village. In fact, he writes, one of his most powerful and known books is called Apples of Immortality. And these are the folk tales of Armenia. He has rewritten these folk tales in a way that opens up to all of America. Sermelian, very haunted man. And then, after dealing with where he came from, he starts writing about the United States. And here's something he writes about in the fields of the Midwest, farm workers. I stopped and watched the Mexicans again. The machines belched their hellfire in the blaze of noon, and the Mexicans toiled for their American masters, their faces and bodies smeared and blackened. God pity them. I glanced at the sign again on the hamburger stand and thought these dark earthmen might prevail in the end. The USA and the USSR might burn each other out in nuclear war, and the Mexican pop up from behind a cactus, grinning under his sombrero and throwing his serape over his shoulder. Ole. I had the pleasure of, my grandfather and Soroyan were friends, and I had the pleasure of visiting him as a teenager, 15, 16. I'd knock on his door. The weeds were about this high in the yard, and he swore that he didn't cut the weeds because there was mint growing in them, and that mint he was cutting for his madzun. And he would invite me in, and I would ask him questions. And I'd ask him, is it possible to be married and be a writer? He said, it's a difficult juggle. He said, I married the same woman twice. And then I would look, and he would have his shoes in the corner, and they were perfectly polished with this French kind of polish. And then he had all these shards of glass and twine and rocks that he collected in these mad, furious bike rides across Fresno. And I once asked him, why do you collect those things? And he said, well, look at the rock. Look how simple it is, but look the beauty it has. And he says, I collect rocks because they remind me that art should be simple. And on the ledge there where the window, he had a tape recorder, and the window was slightly open, and I asked him what was on the tape. I was an inquisitive young kid. And he said, oh, I'm taping the sounds of night. Would you like to hear them? So he put the thing back, and I listened for about 5 minutes, and it was complete silence with maybe a buzz of a fly, and then as morning came, a chirp of a bird. And that was it. And then he told me, I said, when you're a young writer, I was telling him, I'm going through the dictionary and I'm learning all these new words, and I want to use these words in what I'm writing. Yeah, forget about that. He says, count how many words I use in my books. It's 300, that's all. 300 words. But it's the way you put those 300 together. So, incredible, valuable lesson. We talked a little bit about A.I. Bezertes, who was his colleague, who went off to Hollywood. And I had a chance to then, through this book, meet A.I. Bezertes. And let me just read you a teeny bit of my biography. He was closing in on 100 years now, still writing, still living in that strange house on a hill in the suburbs of Los Angeles. Each morning, Albert Isaac Bezertes, father was Greek, mother was Armenian, woke up, took a sip or two from the bottle of Shiraz beside his bed, and returned to the novel he had been writing for the past 50 years. As he saw it, the story would contain every swindle and hard time he had ever witnessed, and the list was as stretched out as a century he had lived. So I began to delve into some of his writing. Bezertes published 2 novels. One, This Is a Happy Land in 1942, and then another book called Long Haul in 1938. Long Haul was adapted into a movie called They Drive by Night, starring George Raft, Humphrey Bogart, and Ida Lupino. He'd written a screenplay for the movie Juke Girl, which was a film about Dust Bowl Okies who had migrated to the middle of California to harvest the crops. The leading role, a liberal-minded trucker, was played by none other than Ronald Reagan. And then he went to work adapting Mickey Spillane's Kiss Me Deadly, and then he came up with the TV series The Big Valley, which starred Barbara Steinweg. And that was kind of a homage to the San Joaquin Valley and all the kind of rich immigrant tradition he saw. Here is a little snippet of Bezertes. He makes a last visit, this character, to the San Joaquin Valley, to this tiny house where his mother is dying and his father. And he's burying a wife, the father, that he never thought he would live to bury. And the father, as the son comes home, is coming face to face with the failure of his life. And here's Bezertes, or the character that is Bezertes. My mother, she was dying on the sofa when I got there, and my father looking terribly unhappy, terribly. I said, "What's the matter, Pa?" And he says, "You know what's the matter. I work and I make no money." And I said, "Money is not important." He said, "I'm a failure." And I said, "You're not a failure. What you did made me do what I did." He said, "I've got no money. I no got anything." I said, "You had nerve, Pa. You kept going and going, and that was the greatest lesson you could give a son, especially a son who is a writer." He said, "You don't think I fail?" And I said, "No, you didn't fail. You kept trying and trying and trying." Pretty soon, he was crying like hell. And I took him in my arms, and he said, "Why you no think I fail?" And I said, "Well, because I couldn't fail watching what you did. You made me brave, Pa." He said, "I made you brave?" And I said, "Yes, very much." He was in my arms crying, and he died like that, right in my arms. So, these have been all men, and I want to introduce you to an incredible woman poet, Helen Pilibosian. Okay. grew up freed of that past, but not really, in Watertown, Massachusetts. Here's her poem, which is where the title of Forgotten Bread comes from. With the bait of bread. Child, you were and you learned to be. For a while, Armenian was a wish you could not fathom. It is still a sea, and we fish in it for food, with the bait of forgotten bread. The moon will be less specific, with the sun and the tides, if you wish, child. You are yeast scattered upon the ground, and the rising dough will grow into tomorrow. You are the yeast of your friends in one language or another. If not already, Armenian will ring in one of your ears someday. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Mark. That was a captivating presentation. I would love to invite the three speakers, Helen, Mark, and Zare to the podium. We're going to do our Q&A. We have 15 minutes for this. And I don't know about you, but I could have listened to their presentations for hours. They were so full of material and so much knowledge. Please join.
Thank you. It's okay.
Okay. First question to Professor Helen. Do we know what was the settlement amount for Getty and the prelacy? Wow. Okay. As expected, right? Second question for Mr. Zareh Arif Shadian. I know Mardiganian's movie is very well sought, but Near East Relief, or the predecessor of Near East Relief, produced 17 short movies. And one of them is called Alice in Hungerland. Have you been able to access those, any of those 17?
Hello? Yeah, sorry. Unfortunately, no. I've been trying to look in different archives. Even Library of Congress doesn't seem to have them, but that doesn't mean anything because sometimes there's a backlog of a lot of stuff that they never got around to catalog. There are, of course, there's so much material that I couldn't do in 20 minutes, and I actually cut it short, way too short. I forgot to even mention the title of the movie that I was showing, which is called The Deep Six, by the way, 1958. So there's so much material out there that unfortunately it is very difficult to have a coordinated effort to look for these things. Because there are material literally around the world, it is going to be very difficult to find the actual prints. Now, the print, whatever has been reviewed or it's been written about, that is easy to find, but still, it's not, of course, as good as the actual material. What condition they're in, and that's a completely different matter, unfortunately. I cannot answer that.
Thank you.
Hi there. I have a comment and I have one or two questions. To Mr. Zari, you said the movie was Deep Six? Deep Six?
Yes.
The movie the last movie you
Yes.
showed? Okay, good, I'll find out. And to Ms. Nagmer, do you know do you suspect what was the settlement, even though it's confidential? And a comment for Mr. Mark. I met Mark at the Alex Theater in Glendale, and you made a powerful speech on the Armenian genocide. You were invited, you were the guest speaker, so I enjoy everything you just said and read all the poems. That was very touching. So thank you.
The settlement, it consisted in a number of points. It wasn't just about funding. So this lawsuit was about title. So the prelacy maintained that the manuscript had been stolen. It belonged to the church. The church had title. It had been stolen in the past. Therefore, the Getty could not have title, even if it were an unwitting buyer. So that was their point. I mean, that was what they alleged, what the prelacy alleged in their lawsuit. So the Getty changed the provenance of the artwork. This is a very big deal in the art world. And in fact, the settlement for art professionals is considered a major model for a successful negotiated settlement with restitution challenges like this. So the Getty acknowledged that the pages, the manuscript fragment was the property of the church. So in 2015, the centennial year of the genocide, the manuscript became again, or was returned to the church. That was very important. At the conclusion of that, or in exchange, or part of the settlement, the church agreed to donate the manuscript to the Getty. So now if you go to the Getty, the wall text says, gift of the Great See of Cilicia, the Catholicosate of Cilicia. So the Getty changed the provenance. The Getty, according to one news reports, paid all the lawyers' fees. So I don't know what that amount is, but it must be huge. Other than that, I don't know if there were any other financial aspects to the settlement that has not been disclosed.
I know it's hard for us to believe things could be confidential in these days of Stormy Daniels and all these other kinds of settlements, but they were back then. Yes.
My question is for Dr. Watenpa. I was wondering, you talked about the pages that were made its way to the Getty, and I was just curious if you could tell a little about the story of the rest of the manuscript and its trajectory.
Thank you, Sean. There's a dramatic sequence during the Battle of Mirage where Dr. Der Ghazarian and his sisters, who are running for their lives, lose the manuscript. The manuscript falls from their hands. This is a terrible night where there's a terrible blizzard. So a few days later, an unknown Turkish man picks up the manuscript, and he begins to have terrible nightmares where a person appears to him and commands him to return the manuscript to Armenians. And so he does return them to Armenians, and that's where the few Armenians who were remaining in Mirage at the time get together, and I've pieced this together from a variety of sources, so there may be some areas of uncertainty in what exactly happened. But the remaining Armenians of Mirage decide to, since they cannot take the manuscript with them, because Armenians were under attack, Armenians who were leaving Mirage were being robbed, they decide to entrust the manuscript to the American missionary in Mirage, Reverend James K. Lyman, whom many of you Mirashis know. So Lyman kept the manuscript with him and made contact with Zaitunsis later on, Zaitunsis who were now living in Aleppo in exile. And they came to an agreement that Lyman would take the manuscript out of Mirage to the Patriarchate in Istanbul, and that's what he does. So he takes it to the Patriarchate, and Sirarpi Denersesyan, the Harvard professor who spent a sabbatical year in the Middle East and went to Istanbul to the Patriarchate Library, studied the manuscript there in 1952. And at either 1967 or 1969, Patriarch Şenork, the Patriarch of Istanbul, took the manuscript to the Republic of Armenia, Soviet Armenia at the time, as a gift to the Catholicos Vasken, who later gave it as a gift to the Madenataran, where it is now. So the mother manuscript repatriated, like so many Armenians, to Soviet Armenia, while the fragment of the manuscript immigrated to the United States.
This question is for Mr. Areshadian. You showed a clip from a film, and you said that it was the earliest spoken Armenian in an American film. Is that earlier than the film with us that Orson Welles did with Akimov? Because I think, which is earlier?
The Arshin Malalan, you're referring to Arshin Malalan? The first English Armenian language film?
Yes, because he speaks Armenian in the film.
This is in 1937. Orson Welles did not hook up with Akim Tamirov until much later. But he was, Tamirov was actually in Ruben Mamoulian's High, White, and Handsome, but he doesn't speak Armenian there. But even though behind the scenes, the story is that both of them spoke Georgian and drove everybody crazy because they couldn't figure out what language it was. But yeah, no, Tamirov comes much later.
Greg Aftandilian. My question is for Mark on Soroyan. He often identified himself as a Bitlissi, as you know. And he took this trip to Bitlis that he wrote about. I think Dikran Kuyumjan put it together as a story with a couple of others. But there was, just rereading that story recently, he had this profound sense of displacement, I guess. Did he ever reflect that to you in your conversations with him, or do you know any more about that? Because that certainly was, at least he would himself would identify that's one of his identities.
You know, I was 15, 16. I wish I was 5, 6, 7 years older. I would have asked him so much. I'd have been a real pain then. I don't think he ever mentioned Bitlis. I know that when we were all meeting and he was dying, there was discussions about where his ashes would be, and he wanted half his ashes in Armenia. But, you know, I think he was, you know, you read My Heart is in the Highlands and things like that. I mean, there was a deep attachment. Even though he was born in the United States, that place loomed very large, you know, as a kind of haunting image. And so all the stories of that there get told, they're conveyed through obviously mother and aunts and uncles. So you never really leave that past. And you know, look at here, I'm all these years later in this new book, I'd say 100 pages deal with the journey out and coming to California and that land becoming a rebirth. So no, but I don't remember anything in particular about him talking about Bitlis. I would have asked him, you're half Jewish, aren't you? But I didn't.
Mark, have you looked into John Harold, the son of Leon Zorabian Harold?
No. Is he a writer as well?
John Harold was, sorry, I'm back here.
Yes.
John Harold was an
disembodied voice.
He was an important figure in the American folk music revival of the 50s.
Okay, no.
And early 60s.
So do you know where the word Harold comes from? Is that just something he put on the last name?
I don't know where.
Yeah.
I'm sure there's
But it's such an appropriate name for what he was doing. I mean, he was heralding, you know, that was his poetry.
Yes.
Yeah. I'll have to look, I will definitely look that up.
An interesting guy in his own right.
Yeah.
Maybe there was an Avadis in the family. Yeah, could be. Could be. One other question. Oh, yes.
This one is from Mark, excuse me, Arax. As you have read a full scope of material literature, they go through a catharsis, they go through reconciliation, they deal with profound pain that informs everything they do. Can you say, does anything jump out at you where they're starting to make the transition from feeling the pain to harnessing the tension to drive themselves forward to a vision that is positive and triumphant and forward-thinking, progressive?
I think Sir Melian was always a dark figure, brooding. Harold, I think, came out of it. And then the ones that are born in the United States, I mean, look at Saroyan, you know, dealt with so much. He was accused of being sentimental. I do remember him telling me once, what is a writer if not being sentimental, you know? And so I think there's this shift. It's almost after they've done what they need to do about the past, only then are they unburdened then to fully embrace, you know, what's going on in this country. You read Saroyan, and I was thinking of maybe reading you guys The Summer of the Beautiful White Horse. But that's another difference between the literature of Armenians who ended up on the East Coast and the ones that ended up in the Valley and the West Coast. On the East Coast, a lot of the writing of the Armenian-Americans was stories of interiors, city life, the interior, the angst, you know, inside the family. You come west, and all of a sudden the land becomes a character. And the land is a character in Saroyan. I mean, you know, there's horned toads and irrigation canals and ditches, and, you know, it's all played out there. In The Summer of the Beautiful White Horse, you know, his cousin comes to him with a stolen horse, and he thinks he's dreaming because no one in that family has ever stolen anything, you know. And off they go across the prairie of the San Joaquin Valley as it's being taken from the horned toad and the jackrabbit and being conquered by the farmer. And so much of his writing had to deal with the exterior, the land. And I think that's something that distinguishes not just when those writers came here and whether or not they were born in Armenia or here, but where they ended up landing.
I've been told we don't have any more time. We're up with, we just completed our Q&A. Let's give a round of applause to our distinguished panelists. And we have a short coffee break, about 10 minutes, and then we'll get started with our panel discussion. Thank you.
I want to ask all of the presenters if they could gather at the front of the stage so we can take a picture before people disappear. temporarily have the screen turned on?
I have a quick question for you. Based on your last question to the questioner, John Harold, the floor, please.
Yeah. A little. I mean, he was in a film called The Greenbrier Boys. They were very influential in folk revival. I know Bob Dylan often has spoken about John Harold and how inspirational figure he was. Not that I know of.
That's my conclusion too. That
someone here has a brand new black Lexus? If you do, congratulations. But secondly, you need to move your car. The license plate, we don't know the license plate. Okay. A black Lexus. Does this ring any bells with anyone? Please see the gentleman up here. He needs you to move your car, black Lexus. Before the last session, we're going to show Peter Muserlian's documentary about Armenian Americans and politics, which some of you saw last night. and now have the chance to see again. So if we can regather and enjoy Peter's work. Okay, we're going to show the video now. Let's gather around the fireplace and tune in.
This kind of music played on the oud goes back centuries, back to the old country, as the old-timers like to say. But on the streets of Glendale, it's a fairly recent phenomenon by historical measurements. We don't know if the parents of Paul Ignatius blasted the music of Western Armenia on their Victrola in the early 1920s, but we do know his family was one of the first Armenian families in Glendale, a city that now boasts about 100,000 Armenian Americans, nearly half the city's population. In his recent memoir, Ignatius, now 97, was a trailblazer in public service among Armenian Americans, serving as the Secretary of the Navy under President Lyndon Johnson. That fact, along with having served as a commissioned naval officer during World War II, led to a distinction not many can put on their resumes: having a U.S. Navy destroyer named after him. Another first among many for Paul Ignatius. So in looking back 100 years, we recognize the Ignatius family as one of Glendale's first. But it was Martin the Armenian who was the first Armenian to arrive in America in 1618, 400 years ago. Stepan Partamian, Armenian-American historian and social critic, recently compiled a 2,000-page book on the accomplishments of Armenian Americans, most achieved over the past 150 years, when 98% of them and their ancestors came to America. Their accomplishments stand out in academia, the arts, sports, law, media, medicine, and science. But it's really only over the past 50 years that Armenian Americans have found their footing in politics, more specifically in elective office.
It was over 120 years ago that my family arrived here in the United States. And even at that time, in Worcester, Massachusetts, one of my ancestors was an organizer, a political organizer. And the reason was that the Armenian immigrants were getting beaten up by the Norwegian immigrants who had come before them because they were taking their jobs and so on. And the police were very often siding with those who were already here against the Armenians. And one of my ancestors, Krikorian, stood up in a town meeting, and it's reported in the newspapers at the time. He says, "There's 500 of us here. If you give me 500 men and we go and show up at City Hall, then we'll see who they listen to." And the same was true in the 1890s as is true now in the 21st century. If we don't show up and participate, then we'll get left behind.
Los Angeles City Council member Paul Krikorian has been the most successful in local government, elected in America's second most populous city. We counted more than 30 other city council members over the years, from Massachusetts to Torrance, from New York to Montebello, and Illinois to Pasadena. Glendale, of course, is now the epicenter of Armenians in local government, with 4 of the city's 5 council members being Armenian Americans. Also Armenian and elected Glendale officials are the city treasurer and the city clerk, who was a young activist years ago when he first approached the woman who held the position he now holds.
There was an Armenian candidate running for city council, and when we approached the city clerk at the time and said, you know, hey, we want materials translated to Armenian, because most of the voters who are Armenian, for them, English is not their first language. And if you're translating it to Spanish for the Spanish speakers to be able to understand, then it makes only sense that in Glendale, a city of roughly 35 to 40% population of Armenian origin, that you also translate it to Armenian. And the response given was that, well, you're considered Caucasian or white, and you know, you're not part of the federally mandated languages that we're required to translate it in, and you know, good luck.
There have been a number of state legislators of Armenian descent on the East Coast, like New Jersey's Chuck Haitayan and Massachusetts Speaker George Kavarian, but no state can point to the numbers in California, starting with Wally Karabian in the early 70s, who at one time served as his party's assembly leader and a role model to so many who came after him: Chuck Pachigian, Joe Samidian, Howard Kalugian, Greg Agazarian, Steve Samuelian, and Khacho Achachian.
Thank you, Madam Speaker.
Currently, there's only one Armenian-American in elective office in all of Sacramento, Audrey Nazarian.
For me, it was important to make sure that Armenian nonprofit organizations that serve the community well are also recognized by the state and are appropriately supported by the state. So I'm very proud of having secured funding for LARC Music Society, which trains hundreds of kids on a daily basis. And I was very proud to kick off the support for the Armenian Museum by securing the first $1 million.
State Senator Anthony Portantino also helped get state money for the Armenian-American Museum, for which they'll break ground in Glendale in 2019. Portantino is not Armenian, but he represents more Armenian Americans than any other politician from a legislative district in the country. Earlier this year at Brand Library in Glendale, Portantino sponsored an event on the status of women in Armenia, one of many such issues on which he's been a leader.
Whether it's the Artsakhi economy or trying to create more trade opportunities between California and Yerevan, again, there's a natural fit between the Armenian businesses in California, in particular in my district, and those economic opportunities in Artsakh and in Yerevan.
Before getting elected to serve in Sacramento, Assemblyman Nazarian served on the staffs of a council member and a congressman. Before that, he was a campaign consultant for a successful Glendale City Council candidate, among others.
In the Armenian community, one of the reasons why I felt it was so important, for example, for there to be a council member in Glendale, was because when you looked at the police and fire departments and you saw that there were many hardworking police officers and firefighters, but unfortunately didn't speak the language, if they're going to be addressing an emergency and if someone's life is on the line by a few seconds, and if they can't, language is becoming a barrier, well, what is the city doing to make sure that they're addressing those issues? So it becomes a life and death issue.
If there's anyone who has been the most influential behind the scenes in Glendale for the longest period of time, building a campaign infrastructure, a political machine really, it's Helen Asatrian.
For me, it's never been really about power for myself, but empowering our community to have a voice, and any really marginalized community to have a voice in their government. And so with that respect, I've always selected candidates that I truly believed would make that difference.
We met Asatrian at Sardarabad Bookstore in Glendale, a city she's worked in since arriving in America from Yerevan as a tween. By the age of 15, she was working on Rafi Manoukian's successful 1999 Glendale City Council race. Since then, it's been candidates for school board, the state legislature, and Congress. Along the way, she made time to work for a combined 11 years as the executive director of the Armenian National Committee of America's Glendale chapter and as the executive director of the ANCA's entire Western region. She started High Votes in 2012, and by 2017, High Votes had registered 50,000 Armenian Americans in Los Angeles County.
We are the margin vote. And so we now become a powerhouse with respect to candidates and elected officials that, whether they like to or not, are now paying attention to us and the issues that are important to us. And at the end of the day, that's what really matters. I've always told our community members that, you know, it doesn't begin or end with elections, right? Somebody that's already elected into office needs to get reelected. And in order for them to actually pay attention to you, they need to see that you have the numbers at the ballot box. And if not at the ballot box, then you at least need to be writing checks and creating partnerships with other community groups to create a voting bloc.
This is the Armenian Church in Scottsdale, Arizona, where a DC-based political advocacy group, the Armenian Assembly, was on hand over President's Day weekend to hold a town hall meeting at the local church hall to educate and motivate the Armenian-American grassroots.
The Armenian Assembly is a nonpartisan
advocacy organization. So that means we work across the aisles. It doesn't matter if you're a Republican or a Democrat or independent. We focus on the issues, and the issues are strengthening the U.S.-Armenia relationship, making sure that politicians and their staff understand the challenges that Armenia faces, whether it's the blockades of Turkey and Azerbaijan, the war rhetoric and the war that's happening that Azerbaijan has launched against Armenia. Those are the types of issues that we focus on.
The Armenian Assembly has also trained summer college interns in Washington, D.C. for decades.
I think it's important to be active, however that is. It could be in the church, it could be in Washington, D.C., it could be in your local community. There's so many different ways to be active. One of the things I think the Armenian Assembly is done very well and can be very proud of is its internship program for over 40 years now, and over 1,000 interns from all across the country, all stripes of life, getting involved in all types of different areas afterwards, whether it's in politics, whether it's in journalism, whether it's in law. This is a great opportunity for Armenian-Americans to come to Washington, D.C. and really get a unique, life-changing experience.
The Armenian National Committee of America, also based in the nation's capital, has an internship program that focuses on fighting specifically for Armenian causes.
Because we have a worldwide diaspora, and the largest community of the worldwide Armenian diaspora is right here in Southern California, it's very important for us to have our collective voices heard in the halls of government and policy making and so on. And as a political force, we can influence American policy and have successfully influenced American policy in that we have been able to secure funding and foreign aid from the United States government for the dual republics of Armenia and Artsakh. We've been able to call for Turkey to be brought to justice, and we've gotten a lot of traction on that. Haven't reached our goals yet, but eventually we will. And we've just been able to mobilize and organize our communities to integrate within American society while at the same time maintaining our cultural identity and our history.
At a fundraiser at the Pasadena home of Rafi Hamparian, the national chairman of the ANCA, Congressman David Valadao from California's Central Valley was brought in to talk about a recent fact-finding trip he made to Armenia, accompanied by Hamparian.
So it was a really quick trip, and the Armenian folks were very, very helpful in making sure that I had a very full schedule and got to see quite a bit in 2 full days. I left California, flew to Yerevan, and landed. The ambassador from the U.S. was there waiting for me. We had an opportunity to visit the Genocide Memorial, visited some schools, met with some locals, got on a helicopter, flew over to Nagorno-Karabakh, met with some folks in the legislature there, got a little briefing, did some interviews, and got a briefing from Halo Trust on some of the demining activities they've got and how they're doing it.
There has never been an Armenian-American elected to the U.S. Senate, and only 6 have been elected to the U.S. House. Stephen Darunian of New York was the first in 1953, and Californians remember Fresno's Chip Pashayan, who was in office from 1979 to 1991. 2 other former congressmen were Adam Benjamin of Indiana and John Sweeney of New York. And currently there are 2 long-serving, high-profile Bay Area California women in the U.S. Congress, Anna Eshoo and Jackie Spear. But if you had to name the most successful elected official of Armenian descent, it would have to be Kurkan George Deukmejian, who was elected to the California State Assembly, the State Senate, 1 term as the state's Attorney General, and 2 terms as the Governor of California. During his 8 years as governor, Deukmejian appointed hundreds of municipal and superior court judges, as well as 2 Armenian Americans to the California State Supreme Court.
City officials and dignitaries from all over the state came out to dedicate the new Long Beach Courthouse, and the guest of honor was the man whose name is on the building, former Governor George Deukmejian.
Absolutely blown away.
And if Deukmejian is the most accomplished elected official among all Armenian Americans, the guy pictured here, Ken Kesheshian, has a record as a political operative that's second to none, with Governor Deukmejian and 2 presidents among those he's worked for. We caught up with Kesheshian here at his law office in San Clemente. In the late 1970s, he spent 4 years here working closely with former President Richard Nixon on his memoirs. This was the beach of Nixon's Western White House. Kesheshian has an Ivy League law degree and has written speeches for Presidents Nixon and Reagan, but don't get the impression he started life on third base.
Well, I grew up in Visalia, which is about 35 miles south of Fresno. I grew up on a 60-acre farm of walnuts and grapes. Dad was a genocide survivor and was born in central Turkey in a little village called Çomaklı in the province of Kayseri. His village was purged in 1915, and in 1918 I lost my grandmother, my uncle, and my aunt, and my dad survived.
It was at UC Santa Barbara that Kesheshian honed his skills to become a great writer. But that college freshman in 1962 was not quite ready for the White House.
Well, the secret is that I had to take what we call bonehead English in UC Santa Barbara. I couldn't really write a declarative sentence. And so it was called Subject A English, but that was a fancy term, but it was bonehead English, and because I flunked the entrance essay on writing.
While Kesheshian was at Columbia Law School, he applied for a job on the Nixon for President campaign. He started out at the bottom of the totem pole, but by the time Nixon was president, Kesheshian was on the speechwriting team.
To go from you know, driving a tractor in the vineyard in Visalia when you're 12 years old to sitting in the Oval Office and listening to the president instruct you on what he wanted to say, it's a pretty big deal.
And it was an Armenian-American who single-handedly inserted the term Armenian genocide in a Ronald Reagan Holocaust proclamation in 1981, Ken Kesheshian. Like the genocide of the Armenians before it and the genocide of the Cambodians which followed it, and like too many other such persecutions of too many other peoples, the lessons of the Holocaust must never be forgotten.
I didn't want to try to slip something under the table or be sneaky about it at all. And so I went through the proper channels to make sure. Now, perhaps if this had gone to the State Department, you know, there may have been another concern. Now, having said all this, after that statement was put out, there was a lot of consternation and whatnot. But, you know, the world didn't come to the end. The world has never come to the end after that statement was said. And diplomatic relations didn't end. And our bases in Turkey were not removed. And so I don't think the world would end if President Trump would stand up and observe the Armenian genocide.
I think in the American political system, Armenian Americans, like every other American, need to be involved, because if we're not involved, we're left out of all of the important decisions that get made in American democracy.
You know, we're always involved in a David and Goliath fight because we are a very small community compared to other communities or compared to the United States society in general. But because we're so passionate of our cause and because we're so well organized and committed to our cause, we have been able to really make our voices heard in every level of government, from the federal on down to the most local grassroots level. And in doing so, we've been able to build a reputation that has been repeatedly calling us the second most effective ethnic lobby in the United States, second only to the Jewish lobby.
For as long as we have people that care about these issues, that want to see the survival of our people, so we're not just a footnote of history, we need to be active, not only in the homeland, but also in nations that afford us the opportunity to make our voice heard and be responsible citizens, be that in the United States, be that in France, be that in Australia, wherever it may be. It is no different than what other communities have done, like Jewish Americans have done, like Latino Americans have done, and it is what makes, I think, America a stronger nation by giving us that opportunity.
Thanks again to Peter for that work. I'm not going to invite him up here again, though, but you can thank me for that later. Before we begin our last session, I really want, which is a sort of a different format, it's more of a more open discussion. I really want to acknowledge the extremely high quality of all the papers that were presented today, and the courteousness of all of the speakers in adhering to the very restrictive time limits. Everyone should know that all of the speakers today have more material than can be contained in 20 minutes, 30 minutes, an hour, or probably an afternoon. They all have volumes worth of material that they can and would like to share with us, and it's very difficult to say anything much in 20 minutes, and each of them said a lot in 20 minutes. So thank you, and please give them some applause. And none of them tried to punch me, which I consider personally a triumph. Our last session is going to be moderated by Mr. Sam Kesheshian, and Sam is an attorney and partner with the E&E Law Group, as well as Krieger and Kesheshian. He has been an adjunct professor of law for over 18 years, teaching courses in legal writing and jurisprudence, and he's been involved with the Armenian academic and cultural scene for over 3 decades, and has helped introduce artists working in various mediums to West Coast audiences. And he very kindly agreed to be the moderator of our final panel of the day. So please welcome Sam Kesheshian to come on up. And I would ask the panelists also to come on up and take a seat.
Thank you very much, Mark. And just for the record, there's still time to punch you.
That's true. It's still early. Do you want to hold the mic?
Good afternoon, everybody. Thank you for hanging in there with us. This is the last presentation. And before we get into it with our illustrious panel over here, I would like to thank and congratulate all of the organizers of this tremendously important conference for this wonderful accomplishment. And I'd also like to particularly single out, if I may, Maggie Mangasarian-Goshen for her tireless work. Thank you, Maggie. Well, let me briefly name our panelists here. We have first Armen Hovhannisyan, Danny Fatante, Seda Antekelian, and you've already met Dr. Demoyan. What I'd like to do is conduct this as informally as possible so that we could have an actual dialogue with these individuals. So having said that, I am going to allow each of them to introduce themselves and give a brief presentation as to their specific involvement and expertise. We'll start with Armen.
If I may, can I do it from up here?
Absolutely.
Thank you. Sorry for changing the script. If I can have a few minutes of your time, I think it's important that we set the stage and go into informal. We haven't had any discussions about how this is really going to play out, but so you get a flavor at least of one of the participants. Let me start it this way. 50 years ago, a young Richard Hovhannisyan wrote a journal article about the life and times of Simon Vratsian, the last Prime Minister of the Republic of Armenia. And you may ask what this has to do with the diaspora and what this has to do in particular about the resiliency of Armenian heritage in America. Well, as much as Vratsian is recognized as one of the centerpieces of homeland history, he was also a consequential leader and one of the finest examples of the staying power and the far reach of Armenianism into multiple countries over a very long period of time. In what comes to me in a very hypnotic way are the words in which Hovhannissian introduces Varatsian in that journal article, and it's the words of Varatsian himself from his Gyanki Urinerov, and it goes like this. He says, "In the beginning was the land of Armenia and the kingdom of Bakratuni, Ani. And Volga, and Ani became Volga, and Volga became Crimea, and Crimea became Don, and Don became the Republic of Armenia, and the Republic of Armenia became the world, and the Armenian became a citizen of the world." Hovhannissian concluded the journal article with his own rhapsody. Simon Varatsian is one of all but vanished generation. Well, we know now that it is totally vanished. He continued, "It was a generation imbued with idealism and self-sacrifice, thirsting for the new knowledge and immersing itself in the literature, history, and philosophy of its own people and humanity. It was this generation that led the Armenian emancipatory struggle and experienced the exaltation and the anguish that rapidly succeeded one another. The annihilation of half its nation, the crumbling of empires and the emergence of new sovereign states. It was this generation that forged the new Republic of Armenia, strove against insurmountable odds to preserve its independence, and tragically delivered it to the Soviets. This generation, its mission in part fulfilled, vanishes. Considerations, internal and external, world and national, had determined its path. That path was the last and long journey which had begun centuries before, and Ani became Volga, and Volga became Don, and Don became Crimea, and Crimea became the Republic of Armenia, and the Republic became the entire world." Those words, Varatsians and Hovhannissians, were written a long time ago, and the Republic and the diasporas of their lives and of their dedication are all gone. Time doesn't wait. Time doesn't wait for you. Time doesn't wait for me. Time has not even waited for our children. It passes. In my own lifetime as a child of and a participant in the rapidly evolving Armenian-American diaspora here in Southern California and in Fresno, California, everything has changed. 250,000 Armenians in the boyhood days, my boyhood days in the 1960s, has turned into 1.5 million. 50,000 Armenians in the LA area has turned into 500,000. And let me say this in a sort of attempt at lightheartedness, but with a tinge of truth. The occasional sighting in the 1960s and 70s at a grocery store in the San Fernando Valley would have brought charm and glee on our faces, but now we have to compete in the fruit and vegetable section with an intent crowd of Armenians. And when we drive home, we say, are we really connected to one another, these people and we? Well, we are. We are. The Armenian diaspora, though, in America has undergone a radical fundamental change far beyond the checkout lines. For all the blessings and all the opportunities that we have, of which there are several, we are faced on a national collective basis with way bigger challenges than we have opportunities and answers. We have more Armenian day schools, but we have fewer students. We have more Armenian churches, but fewer true believers and congregants. We have more great conferences like this, but the same John Doe's, same use, the same ones. Is there somebody here in this audience other than my nephews out here, the Masurlian boys, who dare say that I'm less than 35 or 40 years old? No? Thank you for coming, boys. You've just brought down the curve. We have more individual sophistication, but less collective coordination. We have better education, but haven't yet managed to harness its potential for consumer consumption, leverage, and yes, power. Our traditional organizations, in which I grew up and of which I am a member, by and large still operate, but their ranks have thinned. Their messages are now strained in front of a different and indifferent audience. Their voices have a hard time resonating with an almost wholly transformed Armenian-American public. Time Time does not and has not waited. When we formed, and I'm about to finish, I'm sorry for going over. When we formed the Armenian Bar Association 30 years ago, there were approximately 1,000 Armenian-American lawyers in the United States of America, and our membership, the bar's membership, boasted about half of them, about 500 of them. Fast forward to 2018, where the number of Armenian-American lawyers has more than tripled in the United States, yet our membership ranks hover only at half of what they were. Why the inverse relationship? We now have more in our organization, more internal activities, a greater variety of public services, a wider network of strategic and professional connections, an increasingly coveted access to policymakers and judge makers alike, a growing cachet of investment in the development of democracy in Armenia, a solid reputation as the community's de facto anti-defamation league. So why? Why the inverse relationship between more lawyers at large and fewer under our tent? It's because our community has changed fundamentally. There are more things on these papers that I've written, but I will reserve them for later. All I will tell you is this: we have to develop a new lingua franca, a new vocabulary for the millennials who see themselves not so much as Armenian, they do, but they have deprioritized their Armenianness, not purposefully, not premeditatively, because time has done that. Erosion, as we walk down the same path, it gets worn out. Sure, it's replenished when we put the soil on it to shore it up, and that was shored up with the waves of immigration. And say what we want, in addition to my offhanded attempt at humor, but it's that shoring up of the waves of immigration from Iran and from Lebanon and from Iraq and from Armenia and from Syria that gives us any hope. What Professor Des Moines has done here is unimaginable. And it should make us think that he has put the picture of our past on the walls of a hall bearing the name George Dukmejian. And this man who was born in Gyumri and is one of the leading lights, he had to come to the United States of America to tell us our history, to show us our history. And he's done it in such a fantastic job. We have to find a way of communicating, and so that the next time that Maggie, that Mark, that Nasser, and all of the other great organizations put together their projects, we love each other, but we all know each other. Let's fill the empty seats here.
Thank you very much, Armin. I'm going to reserve my questions until each panel member has had an opportunity to speak. Next, I'll invite Danny Fitante.
Fitante.
Apologize, Dan.
Thank you. My name is Daniel Fitante. I'm just finishing up my PhD at UCLA in the Department of Near Eastern Languages and Cultures. I study Armenian immigration and political incorporation. I've chosen to write my first book-length manuscript about Glendale, sort of in reference to the video we just saw, and sort of pushing back on some of what Mr. Hovhannisyan just said. Glendale is a particularly interesting case study for social scientists because it doesn't really make sense given the theories that we have. Glendale has a community with 40% Armenian representation, and yet 80% of all elected officials of our Armenian extraction. The community is over 70% immigrant. The social scientific research assumes that political incorporation comes after legal and social incorporation, but it hasn't in Glendale. Glendale has the highest racialized voting, among the highest racialized voting in the country. We've done regression analyses, it's over 0.8. In addition to that, you have tremendous internal fractures that we've talked about, and not just regional fractures. Also, we talk about sort of social remittances. So generational cohorts. So a Barskahai who's socialized during in a pre-Iranian revolutionary space versus a Barskahai who's socialized in a post-Iranian revolutionary space, urban, rural. Same in the High Astansi context, pre- and post-revolutionary spaces, and many others. They don't bring a culture of sort of voting with them, of electoral democracy with them, and yet they've sort of outvoted far more than the vast majority of other ethnic populations in the United States. So the dissertation and first book manuscript is sort of an effort to sort of understand and analyze sort of how this happened and make sense of the processes by which sort of this community has inverted the social scientific paradigms of integration into American political institutions. I'm very happy to be here. Thanks very much.
Thank you, Daniel. Next up is Seda Antakelian.
Thank you. My name is Seda Antakelian, and I would like to thank Maggie as well as the committee of the Armenian-American Conference for considering me in this evening's conversation. My name, again, is Seda Antakelian, and currently I work at USC Shoah Foundation, and I'm the Education and Outreach Specialist. They're primarily focused on building content for teachers and resources to supplement and complement their curriculum that they teach in their classroom. My primary focus is actually building content related to the Armenian genocide, utilizing the stories from the eyewitnesses and survivors themselves, their audiovisual testimonies, and creating ready-to-go resources in the classroom to complement, again, the teachers and the textbook, which has very little, as we know, about the Armenian genocide, which is, we hope, changing in the next publication of textbooks. But it is that representation with that work that the Shoah Foundation is doing, Genocide Education Project, as well as Facing History in Ourselves, that really helps to support teachers. So that's what I currently do, and I'm very excited and humbled with that position that I have. And also, I volunteer within the Armenian-American community here in Los Angeles. I, since 2016, have been a volunteer at the Ararata Skijan Museum. I've also worked as a volunteer with the ANCA Education Committee and other organizations such as ARC Family Center, which actually does a lot of self-developmental work for students, youth, adults, and really building their emotional intelligence. And other things that I focus on are really just where I went to school was Loyola Marymount University. That was my background. I got my BA in History and Humanities, and then I went on to UC Irvine to get my master's in teaching, and since then I've definitely worked in different educational spheres, including museums, including the traditional classroom and project-based learning environment, which brought me to where I am now at USC Shoah Foundation. So I look forward to continuing this conversation of where education is going for our students. And with that, I will pass it on. Thank you.
Thank you, Seda. Dr. Demoyan.
Thank you. I had many occasions to speak about the project. Probably I will make some new additions and new revealing for you, specifically for this audience. When I came to America last year in August, well, I tried hard to convince some people in Armenia that the fact that I came to US with family doesn't mean that I came forever, and I still hold the citizenship of Armenia. Still, I convince some people. Another identity crisis I had when, in the same day, Armenian language issue printed my title like a former director of Genocide Museum, but in the same issue, in English, I was still the Armenian Museum director. So this was a really identity crisis, but I came to research identity transformations at Harvard. So a little couple of words about my research. It's really ambitious research I started 15 years ago before I was appointed as a director of Armenian Genocide Museum. I did extensive research in Georgia, in Armenia, and collected tremendous amount of factual materials, fieldwork. My background education is cultural anthropology, so I see differently to the things and the events on the signs and advertisements and the city design, and As a museum man, visual information is very important for me, for my analysis. So my research at Harvard, the Davis Center, is a good occasion to study comparatively what is the situation in post-Soviet Armenia, post-Soviet Georgia and Azerbaijan in memory politics, politicization of history, textbook writing, parallel diasporas, conflicts, how conflicts had an impact on developing new identities and transforming it. Well, in our case, not going to Georgia and Azerbaijan, the epochs are over. What kind of epochs I'm speaking about? Centennial is over, centennial of genocide, of course, I mean. Protocols are gone, so we are without problems left somehow. So now what? The question is, so what? What is the next? We had the chance to cooperate with the hidden rivals during the centennial period. We accused a lot of pages were written during the protocol within the 10 years. Now we have situation in Armenia. You well know what is the situation in Armenia. If you want details, you can ask question. Although I am here 10 months or 7 months, I can give some detailed information. I even wrote about it in my articles. But again, I want to narrow down the situation with the community. I'm not a person, well, as Aram said from Armenia, who came here to teach or lead or regulate. You have your own values, your own, local identities and policies, priorities. But I remembered sitting here that the first time I visited US and I got US visa, right 10 years ago, another anniversary, by the way. 10 years ago, I visited Washington, D.C. The purpose of my visit, first, I'm in the US. It was very hot, July, actually. In 2008, Obama was president, a lot of fans of Obama in Washington, D.C. But I came to Washington to sign agreement to fulfill the major goal of the community, and maybe for all Armenian world, to establish the museum in Washington, Armenian Genocide Museum in Washington. I was excited. Probably I was younger than now, but I really was honest in my excitement. Oh, Genocide Museum, we have to cooperate. Sister institutions, we can exchange materials. First visit was kind of touristic. I traveled around in American museums. I witnessed that we are missing in American museums. Maybe we are in holdings, but as a display, as an information on a permanent basis, Armenians are not there. Even we are not in souvenir shops of the museums. There are not anything about Armenians. So this is the issue. The second year, next year in 2009, when I came again with the invitation of one of the sites who were involved in this museum construction or development, I realized that I became enrolled in a game. It was a rival of two guys, and I became an instrument to strike to another side. And I said, no, thank you. Do not invite me, please. I don't want to enroll myself in Armenian Genocide Museum in dirty games. I'm speaking openly. And it was a great failure for community, and for me, it's also a big tragedy. As a person involved in the developing of Armenian Genocide Museum, permanent exhibition, worldwide exhibitions, we lost opportunity just a couple of years before the centennial. And let me to ask traditional American question, who cared? Who raised the voice? Who protested? Who said, enough, guys, what are you doing? This is our memory, it's not your memory. No one. This is really one of the darkest sides of last decade. The building is sold out, and I pray really for this museum in Glendale. I do not want any quarrels, although I know what does it mean when every Armenian organization are on board. I passed through it, I know. There is experience. But I pray that you will finally have your own place to display memory. Not here, this is temporary exhibition. Book is, okay, it's a book, but you have to extend and show communities' impact, communities' contribution, community service in this country, and to show that we are not ghetto community, isolated. We were not the rug cleaner guys or rug weaving guys or making some good restaurant and making good menus. No, we have to show intellectual development of the community from the very beginning. And if you ask me what is next, well, I said the next is a second edition, but it's a continuation of project in, well, probably in coming years. But another major project I have in my mind, and I'm so glad that my wife is pushing, let's start that one. Please hold, because I'm exhausted with this one. Every book, every project, in my understanding, is a huge soft power instrument. Huge soft power instrument. We have to learn to study exact topic and have an impact on politics, because museums also is a part of the instrument impacting on politics, because you educate future generations. Museum is not a place when you display dead items and artifacts. It's ongoing. Boom of museization in this country is for this purpose. And we are out of the context now. My next project, let me to open the secret. My next project will be a huge and ambitious one called Armenian Tiflis. Still, we have policies not fitting real neighborhood relations. My intention is not to fuel tensions and fuel hatred between two neighbors. We have a lot of heritage, a lot of hatreds and some stereotyping approach, but we have to show the Armenian involvement, input, legacy, and heritage, like this book, in a neighboring country. And I believe that study and research will have tremendous impact on ordinary Georgians, on Georgian politics, and the leadership, because we will show that we were part of their own culture. We were developers, but not looters and destroyers. Thank you very much.
Thank you. I'm going to pose this question generally to the entire panel. Armen passionately identified an unfortunate general apathy, growing apathy within the community, particularly with our younger generations. Danny, you identified some fissures within that community itself that exist today. Seda, you noted that the educational system itself is in need of certain changes. And Ike, you mentioned that we are underrepresented. Armen, you used the word, the need for a new vocabulary. What is that new vocabulary? What do we need to do as a community to advance from where we are now?
It's easy to say that we need a new lexicon, but what it takes is creativity, ingenuity, doing things that are uncomfortable or where we haven't gone before. Let me give a macro and then maybe some practicals. Assimilation, good, bad, ugly, somewhere in between. We're in the midst of it right now at various levels. Let me deal with the bad, or to try to shore it up. We need to, I think, as an Armenian-American community or diaspora at large, try to keep the links to the homeland as real and uninterrupted and unbroken as possible. The challenge with that, though, is that the governance of our Republic of Armenia has not inspired confidence and trust on our part. We have given and we've been burned, many will say. And so we're trying to fend for ourselves. Fending for ourselves is going to be a very, very lonely road in the long run. A road that ends with Israel as the example that we Armenians often go to, the Israeli Jewish connection, the best symbiotic relationship between diaspora and homeland. Programs coming out of your ears and eyes to draw and nurture and ultimately reap the harvest of that relationship, educationally, socially, athletically, in every sector. There is not that reciprocity now, at least. We're over of course, we all know that in the early 90s, we were all caught up in the great swell of optimism. And now the waves come crashing down. So let's go back to, we're not giving up on Armenia, that's our homeland. We're working, we're there. We have programs in place with the new, with the medium, and even with those who reign now, because we have to in a certain way. But what can we do here? We can connect, we talk about youth. The way that you get young people to get here into this hall, I'm convinced of it because we did it in the Armenian Bar Association. You create networks of young people to come, because my son and daughter are not going to want to come and sit next to me all day, but maybe they'll want to come and sit next to their cousins, Sevag and Aram and Haig. Maybe they can go from here and do something else. We have a young lawyers committee in the Armenian Bar Association that we just started after 30 years of existence 2 weeks ago, the first event. And lo and behold, last Saturday when it was raining, for those of you who were here in Los Angeles, over there at the Las Casitas by the 5 in Atwater Village, 100 of them came out. 100 young lawyer Armenians of the Armenian Bar. So we scratched our heads saying that we barely can get 20 or 30 to come to our intellectual events. But when they feel comfortable and at ease with each other, they will come. So in those groups, there are bright lights. Let's not think that they're just undeveloped people. There are some real interesting cats in those places, and we identify those. Just like a teacher identifies the bright students and raises them even higher to other levels. Not disregarding the others, but especially those. Recognition of leadership in the young, and then bringing the young together to be side by side next to each other, because they're going to want to sit in these seats when they have more of their own. From there, there's a whole variety of possibilities of education, social, and about building an academy of walking, academy of thought. Barbara was my counselor at AYF camp. What, last year? No, 40 years ago. And I still remember the rhythm. That's what she gave our generation. She gave us rhythm. And that rhythm doesn't die. So when the music stops, which, I mean, everything stops. So thank you, Barbara, for making sure that the music still is in me. Okay.
I suppose I have a slightly distinct position as sort of a non-Armenian approaching this issue. I would say that I would approach it from a sort of dual-pronged. My approach would be dual-pronged, internal and external. It's sort of an interesting advantage to be able to study the Armenian community right now. And I chose UCLA in Los Angeles to do my doctoral training because this is such a dynamic and interesting moment sociologically. 60 or 70 years ago, people identified in very regionalized terms. Compatriotic societies were very popular, et cetera. More recently, we see national origins playing a big part. We talked about Berutsis or Haistansis, et cetera. Now, and I have the data to suggest this too, starting with the 1.5 generation, we're seeing a more pan-ethnic Armenian sort of conceptualization sort of arise, and that's really exciting to sort of observe. A couple of things that I think might be worth thinking about for the future. The community's capacity to collectivize and mobilize has a lot to do with the way in which it represents itself, right? What are the attributes that are activated in any particular context, and how do we, and who's getting excluded by the attributes activated or deactivated in any particular context? So there's a lot of like internal dynamics that the community works on and is working through. Also externally, the community wants to become, I assume, increasingly indispensable to the host society. I study Armenian mobilization and incorporation in multiple contexts. I was in Moscow a few years ago, and a very different geopolitical situation, but the oligarch billionaire Samvel Karapetyan, he was asked, how is it that he got so rich? And he said, basically, that he made use of Armenian networks. So speaking to the network issue, so basically he monetized Armenian networks. So Armenians in Los Angeles are sitting on what is probably the most valuable of all resources, and that's human networks, right? And the demographic profile of this particular community speaks very well to its potential. So we're talking about a highly educated population, an entrepreneurial population, a population that values home ownership and things of that nature. So if these networks are sort of monetized or mobilized in order to basically in sort of producing, owning, distributing, basically stuff that the host society wants, and then sort of the proceeds reaped therefrom were brought back to the community, I think the potential is basically limitless. And so I think that this generation, the next generation's tasks, now that there's sort of increasing internal coherence, or working on internal coherence, so it will be monetizing, mobilizing sort of this incredibly invaluable network that we're potentially sitting on.
In terms of education and education changes, so the Armenian school and the Armenian institution, a school institution, was created, from my understanding, from my perspective as I see it and reflect back, it was for the community to be together, for community engagement, and also for cultural and heritage preservation. Mainly that's the distinction between itself than another private school, is for the preservation of Armenian culture and bringing that community spirit together. And I will say that I am a product of the Armenian school system, as I went to Merdinyan Varjaran until 8th grade, from 1st to 8th grade. And that's definitely where I can say that I learned Armenian, I was taught Armenian, I spoke Armenian in Armenian class, Armenian history, as well as religion. And I have a lot of friends from Merdinyan that I still talk to today, including my closest friend. And after that, I went to Providence High School, where, interestingly enough, even though it was not an Armenian school, Armenian students we found each other, and again, it was that community spirit, it was that feeling of belonging, sense of being together because we shared something, we had something in common. But what was challenging for us, and what I realized and noticed, is that we didn't actually speak Armenian when we were talking to each other. So that is a challenge that I noticed in schools today, in the way that we are extending and making sure that it's Armenian language and our speaking is continuing outside of just being in an Armenian school or just talking with our grandparents. That's where we need to also focus our efforts. How do we keep that engagement continuing when they're outside at recess? How can we make sure that our students are speaking Armenian at those times?
Since we are very short on time, what I'd like to do is dovetail on something that you've said to perhaps add a last point of discussion. Now, along with what we've discussed as a general, perhaps a malaise in the community, there's also been a steady decline in the use of the Armenian language, oral and particularly written. To what extent does this impede our ability to perpetuate and transmit our culture, or does it at all? To what extent is that language an absolute necessity for where we are striving to go? Whoever would like. Dr. Dan?
Okay. No. I believe that having that Armenian background, for myself, I'll speak on that from my experience, that I speak English currently. It's the most dominant language that I speak. Armenian is very important to me, and I do speak Armenian. However, honestly speaking, because of distance, and because my grandparents are no longer around, or that speaking is becoming less. However, just recently, I was asked to be on Armenian television, and I needed to speak completely in Armenian. And so with that, I used that. Last time I had class was in 8th grade. But what I did was I was able to read, I was able to rehearse, and I was able to speak, unfortunately with not complete confidence, but I was able to speak and articulate what I was trying to say, and I did so successfully, I would say. But I believe that what we need to do is make it so that in Armenian schools now we include the Armenians in Armenia. We incorporate somehow this digital engagement, making a connection between Armenian students here with Armenian students in Armenia. We had pen pals back when we were in 8th grade. What a great idea it would be if we could have pen pals, if students now could have pen pals in Armenian schools in Armenia. So really creating this connection between the diaspora and Armenian students in Armenia would be really something great to continue that way of being relevant, the Armenian language, and really, again, in addition to being involved in the community as well.
A couple of important things, and probably I will elaborate and continue Armen's idea in Armenian context. My study I'm involved is also at some kind of strategic forecasting for 10, 15 years looking forward. Why these 10 and 15 years are important for Armenia and, of course, for Armenian world in general. In the future 10, 15 years will be drastic and a very crucial generation change. The people, decision makers with the Soviet background and with Soviet nostalgia thinking will gone. New generation will come in Armenia. New generation with new threats, with new challenges. And they need help in Armenia. They need help, first of all, diaspora. To help them in decision making, to help them in enrollment in Armenian politics and decision making. And also to help them, they can be helpful, diaspora and young people, to be involved in Armenian politics and everyday life. This is very important to bring together new generation of both Armenia and diaspora together and mingle them in Armenia. Old generation still hold the position with old thinking. That is one of the reasons we have problem in Armenia. We are stuck because of that. But let's plan for next 10, 15 years when this crucial change will occur and the new generation with new experience, with new skills will come forward. And we have to help, first of all, them to stand and be firm.
So Peter Maserlian just showed a film about Armenian Americans in politics and 2 Supreme Court justices. So the question, Sam, was, is the Armenian language, if I understood it correctly, self-definitional? Is it something that you can't be an Armenian without? Well, I knew most of the people on that screen, and many of you did, and I would say that far less than half of them knew Armenian. Maybe they knew, Kharpertsi, Parpar, some kitchen words, and maybe from Chamokhlu, or maybe from somewhere else, but most did not. Are they considered not Armenian? This is a very dangerous topic, I have to say. It's dangerous.
And divisive.
And divisive, but I will tell you this. Armenian language carries in it and with it and through it more than the sum of its words. It does. And for those who didn't have the opportunity or the privilege or the situation to be exposed to it and to learn it, that's okay. But it carries more. It carries a magic in it. But language, again, is not you don't need it necessarily. I have a rotator cuff problem here, a friend of mine back there too, and so if you compare the language is my rotator cuff, how do I make this motion stronger? By building the muscles around it. By building the muscles around it. So the language may not increase, but every other marker, collective and individual marker and definition of your Armenianness will rise up, not to swallow it, but to envelop language ultimately. And then again, you can just learn the language, all of us.
Maybe just one or two things. Sort of tangentially related, I know that in my own field work, this comes up a lot. In fact, I did research on return migration, North American return migration, 2 years ago. I taught it at AUA, and really impressed with the students I had and their sort of worldliness. A lot of the returnees with whom I spoke noted that they'd returned to Armenia because they felt self-conscious about their language ability, and that they'd come back to Armenia in order to sort of compensate for that, to learn the language more thoroughly. And so I know this is something that is deeply psychologically sort of affecting of a lot of young people who don't feel conversant in Armenian. A couple of things that I've noticed also is there are some wonderful immersion programs in Glendale. I think advocating more immersion programs where Armenian students have to be exposed to the Armenian language for half of the school day, at least, and all the materials taught in Armenian. Also, the schools, the private schools here in Los Angeles are oftentimes not sort of carried out in Armenian. I know it's also politically rife, but sort of maybe using Armenian more in the political establishments in terms of the material, that could also help. But no, I don't think, and we see this in Fresno too, we see this in Boston, that third or fourth or fifth generation Armenians not speaking Armenian but still feel very passionately Armenian. I think that as as we move forward, I think more inclusive representation, more inclusive strategies of representing the community might sort of inhibit any sort of marginalization on account of language.
Thank you, Danny. Unfortunately, due to time constraints, we're going to have to stop here in order to allow for some brief time for some questions and answers from the audience.
Good afternoon. My name is Vahram Shemasian. I am the head of the Armenian Studies program at Cal State Northridge. As a full-time professor, I teach 4 courses: language, culture, etc., and Dr. Hasmik Baran teaches a 5th course every semester. We're covering 2 external factors at the same time. One is the non-Armenian external factor in terms of impacting Armenians, assimilation, influences, etc. And the other external factor, but within the Armenian community, is the associations and institutions, organizations, schools, etc., etc. What we're forgetting is the Armenian home, the Armenian house, especially with the new generation of families, parents, etc. 95% of all school-age kids attend overwhelmingly public schools. Overwhelming, and this is reflected in our classrooms. They come with little or no knowledge about their culture, about their past, even their family past. They don't. So what we need to do at the same time to complement all the things that you're saying is to not teach or educate parents, remind them of their role, and create excitement among themselves as well, not between them and the children, their children, but also among themselves. Each and every family home is a museum. Dr. Demoyan is the museum man, a new term. So each and every family is a museum, not of living things, dead things, but living things. The embroideries, the pictures, the family papers, the rugs, the paintings, anything and everything transmitted to them from generation to generation. So why don't we let these youngsters, as well as the young parents, remind them of this fact, and then create interest starting at the family level. That's all I wanted to say. Thank you.
Thank you very much. With the panelists, any of you would like to comment on that, or should we move on to the next question? All right, next question.
Before the next question, I apologize for this bit of, oh, now I've lost it. Sorry. I have to make an announcement. There's a silver Toyota Highlander with license plate of, oh no, now I've done it, jeez. $5LBR278, silver Toyota Highlander. Hopefully that someone's here. It needs to get moved. Thank you. Next question. Yes, sir.
Anunus Hagopian yes, Hayarem bede Hosim. Hosvedjame ver Medicaneng Sezi. Yev Kidenk for Polorosal Amerigati Hayareng. Sarem Vestain for Polorosal Hayareng Askanang. Mian Hosak Tuchunovo Hayaren Yamata. Einer Shagjanagari Batmuta Shagjanagari film in Mechner. Hakchok Gariliu Chunchigavo as Segutum Neun Konemikani had a higher end lag. Each Perfloreska has Kanam, Arans higher end Lesvi Hayu Chunchigarnagilla. Haskaimin Ansnagan Haskato Hochunus Shunagalem.
Another statement, I think.
All right. Well, we'll take one last question then.
All right.
Regarding the first speaker, the professor from Northridge, I have nieces who are half Armenian, half Norwegian. I have nephews who are half American and half Armenian. Regarding the language, it starts at home. If they're like the gentleman over there said, you know, the parents have to be educated. I have friends who are not, you know, became citizens in this country, and they speak English with an accent. They don't even teach one word of Armenian in their own home. They speak English, broken English. The kids know better English than their parents. So everything starts at home. And I have friends that blame the schools. I mean, this is just my opinion, my comments. And a question I have, a comment I have for Mr. Daniel, since you're studying Glendale, I live in Glendale. And Glendale, I've been living in Glendale since 1998. And I can tell you Glendale is a very polarized city today. It's unfortunate. But Glendale, I'll be curious if you're going to write a book. I'll probably buy it. Most likely, I will definitely buy your book, and I'd like to know what you think about Glendale. It's a beautiful city. And regarding a comment that Mr. Hike said about the Armenian Museum, I've been attending all the meetings in Glendale for the Armenian-American Museum, and since I was telling you guys it's a polarized city, it takes education for the non-Armenians to understand why we need an American museum, especially with a population of 80,000 Armenians in Glendale. It is important. It's one of the biggest, probably, Armenian museum west of Mississippi, I believe. So I would like to make a little comments. I attended 2 weeks ago a meeting, and the non-Armenian community came up to me. The biggest issue they have is why we're giving the last green space in Glendale, why we're getting for $1. So I explained to them most so-called ethnic museum, either the land was given for $1 or the land and the building was given for free. So why the Armenian community should be different than an African American community, the Korean community, which they have their own museum, which was given for free. We have the famous Jewish museum in LA, which was, the land was given by Governor Duke Majan under one condition, to expose all the genocide. And if you go there today, it's a little bottom section about the Armenian genocide, and the whole thing is, you know, it covers them. They didn't even follow the rules. So anyway, I was making comments for you guys. I don't know what you guys think about this, but mainly the language, it starts at home. If the parents don't teach it, the kids don't know. And so anyway, that's my comment.
Just briefly in terms of the fracture, I emphatically agree about language at home. That's essential. One of my dissertation advisors, Mukesh Balian, he says that the diaspora that fights together stays together, right? But it's precisely because of the fracture that I became very interested in sort of the Glendale case. Because again, it doesn't really make a lot of sense that you have all this sort of, this community with with very little, like it's not like the Taiwanese of Monterey Park or the Koreans of Irvine that come with, sort of this kind of voting culture, right? So, or with this kind of a greater sense of cohesion. It's precisely because of those internal fractures and their successful mobilization that made the case study so interesting. And I'll be sure to publicize the book when it becomes available.
One more question.
It's a question and a comment. Armin brought up a good point about the youth being here. I'm on the Board of Education for 18 years in Glendale Unified. So before the polarization